The roar of engines tore through the quiet morning, shaking the very walls I once thought were my final sanctuary. Their silhouettes stood there, cold and arrogant, like predators who had chosen me as their prey. A black man daring to dream of peace on the very land my ancestors left behind. I didn't know that on that day, what I planted wasn't just seeds, but a fire that would burn down a rotten empire. They thought I was weak, nameless, easily crushed beneath the heel of their power. But they didn't suspect that beneath the soft soil I knelt on every day lay a secret capable of toppling everything. A secret even I hadn't dared to face. Have you ever wondered what happens when those in power decide you don't belong in the place you call home? When absurd laws become weapons, and greed turns into a blade held at your throat. This isn't just my story. It's a wake-up call for anyone who's ever been looked down upon, trampled simply for being who they are. Leave a comment with the number 9, so we know you're ready for the next chapters of this tale. Don't forget to hit the like button on the video and subscribe right now, because what's coming next will keep you glued to the screen, and might just make you stand up to face the enemies lurking in the shadows. I'm Marcus Freeman, 47 years old, a black man born and raised in the poor suburbs of Birmingham, Alabama. After more than 2 decades working as a civil rights lawyer, fighting unjust cases at my law firm in Atlanta, I moved to the peaceful outskirts of Pinewood Heights 8 years ago, hoping to find some calm amid the storms of life. I'm not one to brag, but I'm proud of what I've overcome. From suspicious glances, whispers behind my back, to doors slammed shut just because of the color of my skin. Now, I live alone in the small house my ancestors left me, tending plants and finding joy in simple things. But I never imagined that even here, where I thought I could breathe, people like Nancy would still find ways to tear down everything I've built. I never thought 4 massive bulldozers would block my driveway on a frigid Tuesday morning, or that Helen Varnell, the chairwoman of the neighborhood association, would stand there, smirking with smug satisfaction behind them. But they had no idea who I was, no clue that I owned the very ground beneath their feet, and certainly didn't expect that I'd been facing down people who underestimated me since I was a child. What would you do if you discovered the loathsome neighborhood association wasn't just illegally harassing you, but also stealing tens of thousands of dollars from your neighbors, people who've already endured enough injustice in their lives? I still remember the day everything changed. The gentle morning sunlight warmed my back as I knelt on the soft earth by the driveway, carefully planting the last of my bean seedlings in the garden. After 22 years of grinding 90 hours a week in the legal field, I'd found peace in nurturing plants. The feel of smooth soil between my fingers and the hope of meals grown by my own hands kept me sane in this chaotic world. What do you think you're doing? A sharp voice sliced through my thoughts. I looked up to see Helen Varnell standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her designer sweater clinging to her frame. Her dyed blonde hair didn't budge in the wind. Her lips pursed into a thin line of contempt. "Good morning, Helen," I replied, slowly wiping my hands on my worn gardening apron, trying to keep my voice steady, just expanding the vegetable garden a bit. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the neat rows I'd just set up along the driveway. "This is unacceptable, Marcus. Front yards in Pinewood Heights must have approved ornamental plants from the designated list. Vegetables belong in the backyard, out of sight." I took a deep breath, swallowing the anger rising inside me. Helen had been the HOA president for 7 years, and in that time, this once friendly neighborhood had turned into a battlefield of petty rules and surprise fines. But for me, it was more than that. Every time she looked at me, I saw that look, the one I'd faced my whole life. A black man who didn't belong here, whether I owned the house or not. "Helen, my property deed predates this HOA by 40 years. I'm exempt from most of those rules," I said, standing up straight, feeling the contrast between my dirt-stained jeans and her polished exterior. "That means nothing here," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." I stood still as she snapped photo after photo, her fingers flying across the screen like a predator marking its prey. 3 neighbors walking by paused, watching curiously. A few glances darted my way, then to Helen. I knew what they were thinking, even if no one said it aloud. I've read every line of the HOA agreement, I said, keeping my tone calm. And I've got letters from the old board confirming my exemptions. Want to see the paperwork? She waved a dismissive hand, her voice dripping with disdain. Save it for the hearing. You'll get an official violation notice tomorrow. I suggest you clean up this mess. She gestured at my garden. Before the fines start piling up. As she turned and walked away, I caught Mrs. Clara Elwood across the street giving me a sympathetic look. Last month, Helen had fined her $700 for putting up a shade for her dog, claiming it ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic. To me, it wasn't just about rules, it was an excuse to target people like me, people who didn't fit the perfect picture Helen wanted to paint. That night, true to her word, a bright red violation notice was taped to my front door. A $75 fine per day until the unauthorized agricultural activity in my front yard was removed. The hearing was set for 10 days later. I brought the paper inside, adding it to the thick file I called my HOA nonsense folder. But this time, something felt different. It wasn't just another fine. It felt like a declaration of war aimed straight at me, at who I am. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Ruth Jackson, an elderly woman living a few houses down. One of the first residents here before this place was even called Pinewood Heights. Marcus, honey? Her voice trembled over the line. I saw Helen giving you trouble this morning. You're not the first. Last week, she fined the DeVises $900 for their little boy's wheelchair ramp, said it didn't match the neighborhood's architectural style. They're black, like you, and I know it's not a coincidence. My blood boiled. That can't be legal. It's not, Ruth confirmed. But they couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and repainted the ramp. Helen's been getting bolder ever since her buddy Daniel Powell became the HOA's lawyer. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. That night, sleep didn't come, not from worry, but from rage. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper before heading to the office. My family once owned nearly all of this land before selling it to developers in the 1960s. My father had mentioned something about retaining certain rights, but I'd never paid much attention until now. I was rummaging through old boxes in the attic when I heard the sound of engines outside, loud and heavy. I rushed to the front window, and my heart seemed to stop. For massive bulldozers blocked my driveway, completely trapping my car. Helen stood there in a stiff white suit, next to a tall man in an expensive suit I'd never seen before. A small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves, their eyes fixed on me. A black man facing down an entire system. I stepped out onto the front porch, heart pounding, gripping my phone and the HOA documents tightly. Whatever game Helen was playing, she just made a big mistake. Her triumphant smirk sent a chill down my spine. The bulldozer drivers sat still, awaiting orders. Marcus Freeman, Helen called out loudly, her voice echoing across the street. The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violation is so severe that we're authorized to take immediate action. The man beside her stepped forward. I'm Daniel Powell, legal counsel for the Pinewood Heights HOA. These, he pointed at my vegetable beds, are unauthorized structures and will be removed under Section 12.7 of the bylaws, an emergency remedy for a community hazard. The crowd fell silent, stunned. Mrs. Linda Marwood covered her mouth in shock. The Selwyn kids stopped pedaling their bikes, staring. I stepped down the stairs, my mind racing for a strategy. I needed to buy time. Mr. Powell, I said, keeping my voice steady, you might want to double-check your legal footing. These aren't structures, just temporary garden beds. And more importantly, you're about to make a mistake more costly than you can imagine. Powell's smile faltered slightly. Your threats don't scare us, Mr. Freeman. We have full authority under the HOA charter. Helen stepped closer, strutting as if she owned the world. Marcus, this stubbornness is so unnecessary. Agree to remove that ugly mess. Pay the $450 in accumulated fines, and this will all be over. The bulldozer's engines roared louder. The nearest driver glanced at me, then at Helen, visibly uneasy. I pulled out my phone. Before you start, I should warn you I'm recording this. and I've just texted a colleague from my law firm to come here. Oh, and there's one more thing about this land you should know. Helen rolled her eyes dramatically. Don't pull your silly lawyer tricks, Marcus. Nothing you say can stop this. Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The crowd parted as Sheriff Jackson stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a thick stack of documents that looked like county records. Helen frowned, then panicked. What is this? A minor HOA matter doesn't need police involvement. I gave a small smile, my first of the morning. Helen, I'm afraid you don't realize whose driveway you've just blocked, or whose land your bulldozers are parked on. The county clerk, Sarah Milton, set a pile of oversized maps on the sheriff's hood, fumbling slightly under their weight. The crowd edged closer, buzzing with murmurs. The bulldozer drivers shut off their engines, sensing the shift in the air. This is the original survey map from 1968, Sarah explained, pointing to the yellowed pages. And this is the land sale agreement between the Freeman family and Pinewood Development Company. Helen interrupted, her confidence visibly cracking. Nonsense. These ancient papers can't override our HOA authority. Sheriff Jackson cleared his throat. I suggest you listen carefully to what Ms. Milton has to say. The clerk adjusted her glasses. Per the records, when the Freeman family sold the land for development, they retained certain rights. First, mineral rights beneath the entire 300 acres of this project. Her finger traced a boundary encompassing the whole neighborhood. Second, full utility rights under the main roads, and most importantly, complete exemption from any future homeowners association for 7 lots they kept for the family. I stepped forward. My house is one of those 7 lots. Daniel Powell frantically flipped through his briefcase. Impossible. The HOA charter applies to every property in the area. There's no mention of exemptions. Sarah smiled patiently. That's because your HOA was established in 1998, Mr. Powell. These agreements were filed with the county in 1968. Your charter can't supersede prior legal arrangements. Helen Varnell's face flushed red with fury, her eyes bulging as if she could will everything to bend to her command. This is just a cheap trick, she shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation. Whatever special pass Marcus's pigsty might have, he can't just trample community standards. Standards that keep people like him in their place. Her words were unmasked, a dagger aimed straight at my skin, my heritage, my very existence in Pinewood Heights. Actually, Sheriff Jackson interjected, his voice deep and authoritative like a low growl. County law says he can do whatever he wants on his land as long as it doesn't violate zoning rules. And I checked. Growing beans doesn't break any residential codes. The crowd had now swelled to nearly 50 people, a tense sea of chatter. I saw Clara Elwood trembling as she filmed everything on her phone, capturing every word. Linda Marwood whispered urgently to her elderly mother in a language I didn't recognize, her eyes darting between me and Helen with a mix of fear and defiance. Helen whipped around to the bulldozer drivers, her voice cracking like a whip. Don't just stand there. This changes nothing. Start the engines and level everything now. The lead driver, a burly man with a weathered face, shook his head and stepped back from the controls. Sorry, lady. I'm not risking my job or my license on disputed land. You want me to do it? Get me a court order first. I'll have one before the sun sets. Helen screamed, losing all composure, her finger jabbing at his face as if she could tear the air apart. I stepped closer to Helen and Daniel Powell, my voice dropping to a cold, sharp tone that cut through the retreating engine noise. There's one more thing you don't know, Helen. Those 4 massive machines, they're parked on my driveway land these papers prove I own outright. That's not just trespassing. It's an assault on my property, ordered by you to destroy what's mine. I paused, letting the threat hang like a blade. And I don't take kindly to people who think they can casually crush a black man's rights. Daniel grabbed Helen's arm, whispering something frantic in her ear. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through her arrogant shell. Sheriff? I turned to Jackson, my voice calm but hard as steel. I want to file a report. Attempted property destruction and trespassing, for starters. Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening. We'll do it right here, right now. Helen erupted, her voice like the screech of a cornered demon. This is absurd. The HOA has ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for 12 years. You can't just waltz in with some ridiculous special rights and ruin everything we've built. Before I could respond, a frail but resolute voice rose from the crowd. Ruth Jackson stepped forward, her cane tapping the sidewalk with steady thuds. It's not new, Helen, she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the tense air. Some of us here have known about the Freeman exemptions for decades. The old board respected them, until you took over and decided a black family's legacy was worth nothing. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a wave of unease rippling through. Helen glared at Ruth, her words hissing through clenched teeth like venom. Stay out of this, old woman. Your holiday light violation hearing is in 5 days. Don't think I've forgotten. Gasps erupted from the crowd, stunned by the blatant threat aimed at the beloved 85-year-old widow. Ruth smiled gently but defiantly. Oh, I don't forget either, Helen. In fact, my memory's sharp. I remember when your husband built that gaudy deck extending 3 meters onto the Langston's land. And Daniel here cleared that violation for what reason? Administrative discretion. Was it? Funny how the rules bend for certain people, isn't it? The murmurs turned into a low roar, the crowd's anger palpable as Helen's face darkened, her eyes darting among the hostile faces closing in. Daniel Powell glanced at his watch, sweat beading on his forehead. Helen, we need to pull back. Discuss this privately. We can schedule a formal meeting. No meetings? I cut in, my voice like tempered steel. My land is beyond your control. Move those bulldozers off my driveway now, or I'll add a list of charges you can't dodge. Sheriff Jackson stepped forward, his towering frame imposing. Everyone, calm down. Ms. Varnell, Mr. Powell, I suggest you order the drivers to clear out. Mr. Freeman, we'll file the report as soon as the area's free. Helen's eyes darted around the crowd, wild and desperate, realizing her grip on power was slipping. Neighbors who once cowered before her now stared back with curiosity, some with barely concealed glee. This isn't over, Marcus, she hissed, her voice a curse that chilled me. You'll pay for daring to defy me. As the bulldozers retreated, Ruth touched my arm, her trembling hand steady with purpose. Marcus, there's something you need to know about the HOA's financial records. What is it? I asked, keeping my voice low. She glanced around, wary of the noisy crowd. Not here, too many ears. Tonight, 8 o'clock, come to my place. Bring those land papers. We've only scratched the surface of the dirty game Helen's playing. As Helen and Daniel slunk back to their gleaming sedan, I saw something I'd never noticed before. Real fear in their eyes. Whatever they'd hoped to hide by rushing to destroy my garden, they now knew they'd awakened a beast far bigger than a mere land dispute. The last bulldozer rolled away, leaving my bean beds standing proud in the morning sun. Sheriff Jackson approached, report book in hand. Ready to file? I watched Helen's car speed off, tires squealing on the pavement. Absolutely. And Sheriff, you might want to call the district attorney. This is going to stink worse than just trespassing. Ruth squeezed my hand before we parted. 8 o'clock tonight, Marcus, she whispered. Bring a notebook. You'll need it when you see what I've found. The crowd dispersed, but many lingered, eyeing my garden with newfound respect. Helen had meant to crush me, a black man daring to claim his place, but instead, she'd turned my little plot into a battle cry. I just wanted to grow beans in peace. Now, I was about to topple a rotten empire exploiting us all. Blood rushed to my face as the bulldozer's engines roared outside, shaking the walls. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their shadows flickering like vultures circling a carcass. I had to act fast. My hands shook as I dialed the one person who could turn this around. County Clerk's office. This is Lydia, a voice answered. Lydia, it's Marcus Freeman. Remember those old land papers we talked about 3 weeks ago? I need them here now. It's life or death. Helen strutted across my yard like she owned every inch, barking at the bulldozer crew, pointing at my garden beds with red-painted nails. Daniel trailed behind, nodding like a puppet, scribbling on a clipboard. "You've got 15 minutes to say goodbye to that pathetic patch, Marcus," she shouted, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that turned my stomach. "Next time, maybe you'll learn to behave and follow the rules like the civilized folks around here." The jab cut deep, not just about the garden, but about me, a black man daring to challenge her pristine white kingdom. I stood firm, unflinching. "I suggest you don't touch anything until Lydia gets here," I replied, my voice low and laced with menace. "Who the hell is Lydia?" Helen snapped, her smirk faltering for a moment. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, my eyes locked on hers. The next 12 minutes stretched like an eternity, the air thick and suffocating. The crowd across the street grew. Some looked sympathetic, others snickered as if watching a show. Clara Elwood's camera kept rolling, live streaming everything as the tension escalated. Lydia's truck screeched to a stop exactly 11 minutes later, accompanied by 2 assistants hauling 6 massive boxes of documents. Helen's smug grin wavered, her eyes narrowing. "What's this nonsense?" Daniel demanded, stepping forward, hand extended. "Daniel Powell, HOA legal counsel." Lydia ignored him, cool as ice. "Lydia Grayson, county clerk. I hear there's a dispute over a piece of historically significant land. Value you might not want to mess with." I smirked, helping her spread out yellowed maps on the truck's hood. The oldest one was dated 1892, the first land transaction of my great-grandfather. "Ms. Varnell," Lydia said, adjusting her glasses as she pointed to a faint boundary line. "Are you familiar with the Freeman Land Trust, established in 1919? Helen crossed her arms, scoffing. "Very funny. We have clear HOA bylaws." "Bylaws mean nothing against county and state law." Lydia cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. I pointed to a section in a newer document. "Here, the 1965 land sale, when my grandfather sold the lots that became Pinewood Heights. Read this part." Daniel snatched the paper, his face paling as he skimmed it. "It states the Freeman family retained mineral rights and utility easements," Lydia explained, "plus full exemption from any future HOA for 9 lots they kept, including Marcus's house." Helen stammered, her face twisting with rage. "Impossible. Do you remember that special infrastructure fee everyone in Pinewood Heights pays to the county each year?" I asked softly, my voice low but cutting. "That money flows straight into the Freeman Family Trust, payment for the utility easements we still legally own." The bulldozer drivers exchanged nervous glances, one hurriedly shutting off his engine, the silence hitting Helen's arrogance like a punch. "Those bulldozers," I continued, pointing at the 4 hulking machines blocking my driveway, "are parked right on my utility easement. That's trespassing on private property. Property of a black man you thought you could just flatten." Helen lunged for the documents, yanking at them. "Let me see. This has to be a scam." But just then, a patrol car roared up, siren blaring, lights flashing. Sheriff Jackson stepped out, his face set like stone, nodding to me before turning to Helen. "Ms. Varnell, I got a report of attempted destruction and trespassing at this address. This is an internal HOA matter." Helen hissed, her voice like a snake's rasp. "The police have no jurisdiction." Jackson pulled out his report book, his tone icy. "Actually, they do. When Mr. Freeman's grandfather sold this land in 1965, he set a clear condition. All disputes fall under county authority, not your HOA's private circus." Daniel Powell trembled, his professional veneer crumbling. "Helen, stop this. If it's real." "It can't be real," Helen screamed, but her eyes betrayed raw fear she couldn't hide. The crowd had grown to over 60 people, holding their breath as another car pulled up behind the patrol vehicle. Clara Elwood raised her phone higher, live streaming it all, her hand shaking with excitement. "Marcus?" Helen suddenly switched to a sickeningly sweet tone. "We can talk this out like adults, can't we?" Jackson stepped forward, report book open. "I need those bulldozers gone now." The drivers were already climbing into their machines, eager to escape the chaos. But what happened next froze everyone. The back door of the car behind the patrol swung open, and a familiar figure stepped out. Someone no one expected. Someone who'd turned this entire fight upside down. "Stop those machines right now." The voice belonged to Ruth Jackson, the 85-year-old widow who lived 5 houses down from me. She leaned on her cane, moving slowly but with eyes blazing like an unquenchable fire. Helen rolled her eyes, dripping with sarcasm. "Ruth, go home. This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Ruth let out a dry, cutting laugh. "When you threatened me with a $700 fine over Christmas lights last December, you made it my business." I'd rarely seen Ruth since helping her with paperwork after her husband's death last year. She'd kept to herself, avoiding trouble. "Mrs. Jackson," the sheriff said gently, "maybe you should—" "I'm exactly where I need to be," Ruth interrupted, turning to me. "Marcus, show me the 1965 map." Stunned but quick, I found the paper she wanted. Ruth raised a bony finger, pointing to a section of Pinewood Heights. "Look here, 11 lots, including mine, were part of the original sale agreement. Marcus isn't the only one exempt from your tyrannical HOA." Lydia Grayson leaned in, adjusting her glasses. "She's right. The original lots all carry the same protections." Helen's face contorted with fury. "Ridiculous. The HOAs controlled those lots for years. Illegally." Ruth shot back, then turned to the crowd. "Phineas, Loretta, Victor, your original residents too." 3 elderly people stepped forward, bewildered but curious. "Is that true?" Phineas Garrett, who'd lived in the corner house for 45 years, asked. "They can't make me take down my radio antenna or fine me for my birdhouse?" Loretta Vance added, her voice trembling. I saw realization dawn in their eyes. Years of HOA bullying, unjust fines, and forced home changes under rules that didn't apply to them. Daniel pulled Helen aside, whispering urgently, her face darkening with every word. But Ruth wasn't done. She raised her voice to the crowd. "How many of you have been harassed by this HOA? Fined for petty nonsense? Threatened with lawsuits over trivial mistakes?" Hands shot up everywhere, murmurs turning into a roar of outrage. Comments on Clara's live stream exploded like fireworks. "This isn't just about Marcus's garden," Ruth continued, her voice thundering. "This is about how the HOA, under Helen's grip, has abused its power relentlessly, trampling over us. Especially those whose skin color she doesn't want to see." Jackson nodded. "I've had over 40 complaints about this HOA in the past 18 months. More than all the other HOAs in the county combined. Threatening seniors with hefty fines, penalizing guest parking without notice, trespassing on people's land." Helen shoved Daniel aside, her face twisted with fury. "All lies. We're just enforcing rules everyone agreed to when they moved here." "But not everyone agreed," I said softly, my gaze burning into her. "And you know that, don't you?" The air was taut like a string about to snap. The bulldozer drivers had fully retreated from the driveway, clearly wanting no part of this mess. "This isn't over, Marcus," Helen hissed, her voice a venomous curse. "The board will handle this, and we'll take action." "Speaking of the board," Ruth interjected, digging into her oversized purse, "I have something everyone needs to see." She pulled out a thick stack of files and handed them to me. I opened it, my legal instincts kicking in: bank statements, transfer records, company formation documents. "Where did this come from?" I asked, stunned. Ruth gave a faint smile. "My husband was an accountant for 55 years before he passed. When they fined me over the Christmas lights, I got curious about where the money went and requested public records. I flipped through the pages, each one a revelation. The HOA collected special assessment fees from every household for park repairs. Yet the park remained as run down as it was 5 years ago. Over $450,000 had vanished into a company called PWH Ventures LLC. The final page was the LLC registration, listing 2 managing members, Daniel Powell and Helen Varnell. Helen saw what I was holding and lunged to snatch the files. "That's HOA private property." Jackson stepped between us, his voice stern. Back off, ma'am. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see what had Helen panicking. Daniel quietly slinked toward his car, trying to vanish. These are serious allegations, Lydia said, peering over my shoulder. If these documents hold up, this goes beyond an HOA dispute. It's criminal. Helen's mask of confidence shattered. You don't know who you're messing with, she growled at me. My husband golfs with Judge Colton every Saturday. This will disappear by morning. I met her stare, voice calm. You should check the news, Helen. Judge Colton retired last week after an ethics probe. The crowd buzzed, Clara zooming in tight. Ruth touched my shoulder, whispering, There's more, Marcus. So much more. As Jackson began taking statements from neighbors about HOA abuses, I wondered how deep this pit of corruption ran and who else was involved. Whatever it was, it would change this community forever. My hands trembled as I opened Ruth's files. Inside were bank statements with glaring yellow highlights marking odd figures. The HOA had quietly siphoned an extra $450 a month from each household for so-called community park upgrades. Yet the park was as dilapidated as it had been 5 years prior. Over $600,000 gone, I whispered, my finger tracing the column of numbers. Where did all this money go? Ruth leaned closer, her voice low but sharp. Keep flipping, Marcus. The next page revealed funds flowing into a company named Varnell Powell Solutions. I looked up at Ruth, mouth agape. Helen Varnell and Daniel Powell, she said, her voice barely audible. They've been stealing from us for years. How did you find this? I asked, still reeling from what I was seeing. Ruth's eyes glinted, a mix of sorrow and pride. My husband was an accountant for 55 years before he died. He taught me how to read these things. When Helen fined me $350 for leaving holiday lights up 3 days too long, I got furious and dug into the HOA records no one bothers to check. I pulled out my phone. We need to tell everyone now. Wait. Ruth placed her hand on mine, her voice urgent. There's more. Look at the last page. The final document sent a chill through me. Helen and Daniel planned to use HOA rules to force 7 elderly homeowners to sell below market value. They'd buy the properties through their company and flip them for triple the price. They targeted people who couldn't fight back, Ruth said, her voice trembling. Like me. Living alone, easily scared by lawsuit threats. Sheriff Jackson, who'd been listening, shook his head. This isn't just an HOA issue anymore. It's outright fraud. I stood tall, resolve hardening. I'm calling an emergency neighborhood meeting tonight. For hours later, I stood in the packed community center. People filled every chair, lined the walls, and even crowded outside the windows to listen. I hooked my laptop to the big screen, displaying each piece of evidence. The people we trusted to manage our neighborhood stole over $600,000. I said, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. Money meant for park repairs, roads, playgrounds. Gasps echoed as I pointed out the vanishing funds. When I revealed the plan to evict the elderly, furious shouts erupted. Where are Helen and Daniel? Someone yelled. They were invited to this meeting but fled, I replied. Their absence says it all. Mr. Phineas Garrett, a retired judge from the corner house, stood up. I motion we vote now to remove the entire board and appoint temporary leaders until a formal election. 82 hands shot up in favor of dissolving the current HOA. As neighbors lined up to sign the legal papers I'd prepared, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Helen's name flashed on the screen. I stepped outside to take the call. You've destroyed everything, she roared, her voice a mix of rage and panic. Who do you think you are to do this? Just because your ancestors once owned this filthy land. It's not about winning, Helen, I replied coldly. It's about doing what's right. Right? She sneered, her laugh hollow. You don't know who you're up against, Marcus. That little garden of yours is just the start of what I'll take from you. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood in the dark wind, wondering what she'd do now that the whole neighborhood knew the truth. Inside, people formed groups, one to audit the HOA's finances, another to review and simplify neighborhood rules. Ruth sat at a table, Neighbors gathered around, engrossed as she explained how she uncovered the scheme. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Check your security camera now." I opened the app, and the footage from my house chilled me. 2 figures in black in my front yard. Though the light was dim, I recognized Helen's blonde hair and Daniel's tall, lanky frame. They were yanking out my plants, tossing them around like wild animals. I showed Jackson, who immediately called a patrol car to my house. But as we watched the screen, Helen looked up, stared straight into the camera, smirked wickedly, and made a throat-slashing gesture before she and Daniel jumped into a car and sped off. Another text came. "This is just the beginning. When I'm done, you'll wish you'd never planted a single seed. Can we get them for this?" I asked Jackson. He nodded. "Trespassing, vandalism, and with this threat, maybe more. But be careful, Marcus. Cornered people are dangerous." Ruth placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." Looking at the determined faces around me, strangers just days ago, I knew she was right. Helen and Daniel once had money and power, but we had something stronger: truth and unity. My phone buzzed again, a text with a photo. I opened it, and the blood drained from my face. A picture of the old exemption papers proving my land rights, scribbled over in red with the words, "Old paper burns easy." I jolted awake at midnight to the sound of shattering glass. Rushing to the kitchen, I found the window smashed, my garden in ruins. The camera caught Helen and Daniel wrecking my plants at 2 in the morning. I texted Ruth immediately. Within 45 minutes, 6 news vans parked outside my house. Reporters swarmed. "Is it true the HOA president trashed your property after you exposed their theft?" By noon, 40 neighbors showed up with seedlings and shovels. "We're with you," Mrs. Clara Elwood said. Someone I barely knew. "Helen fined me $700 for a birdhouse last year." Jackson arrived, papers in hand. "Helen and Daniel are in custody." The county found $600,000 missing from the HOA account. That day, the neighbors voted to replace the HOA with a friendly group, drafting fair rules that let everyone plant and live true to themselves. 3 months later, we held a big block party on Helen's old lawn. Her house sold after she went to jail. The new family loved the community garden idea. "You changed everything," Ruth said, handing me the season's first tomato. I smiled. I didn't want to own the county. I just wanted to grow vegetables in peace. But looking around, at smiling faces, a thriving garden, I knew I'd done more than that. Marcus Freeman's story isn't just an emotional journey of resistance. It reflects deep-seated issues in modern society, where racism, abuse of power, and corruption quietly seep into communities, from small neighborhoods to large organizations. I feel the strength of perseverance and unity. When Marcus refused to bow to injustice, he didn't just protect his garden. He sparked a spirit of defiance in those around him. From this tale, we learn that no matter how powerful the enemy, truth and community solidarity can tear down any wall of power. In today's world, we need to learn to speak up, research our rights, and support each other against injustice. Not with violence, but with knowledge and togetherness. Note: this story is for entertainment and education only, not meant to discriminate, criticize, or defame any individual or group. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to explore more meaningful stories together. Thanks for watching this story to the end. Wishing you a peaceful day, and see you in the next videos.